Did you know that bananas are radioactive? Would you believe it if I said that a truckload of bananas could set off a radiation monitor at a port? Well, both of these statements are true, but does that mean you shouldn't eat bananas? Well, of course not. Bananas are completely safe, but let me explain why. Well, first of all, like many foods, bananas contain potassium. A very small amount of potassium, about 0.1% of naturally occurring potassium, is potassium-40, and potassium-40 is a radioactive isotope. So all foods that contain potassium are slightly radioactive, so your potatoes, your salt substitute, are radioactive. There are a lot of naturally occurring radioactive elements that we come in contact with every day, including in your food. In fact, your body contains radioactive elements like potassium, carbon-14, thorium, even uranium. So in reality, you're radioactive too. Now, should any of this concern you? The short answer is no, but let's talk about why. We are all exposed to a certain amount of background radiation every year, and it's nothing to be concerned about. It's just part of life. Not all radiation exposure is dangerous or scary. So why can a cargo container full of bananas set off radiation detectors at a port? Well, first of all, bananas are all imported, so they're all going to arrive on ships and come through ports, and they're going to be monitored when they come through those ports. There are actually large portal monitors at the ports that allow for the scanning of vehicles and their cargo. All cargo that comes through ports in the United States is scanned by radiation detection equipment in order to detect any radioactive material. And these detectors are sensitive enough that a container full of bananas could set off the alarm. You may have heard in the news recently about radioactive shrimp being recalled in the United States. Well, this was found when radiation was detected at the port of entry for some of this shrimp. Now, this shrimp contains cesium-137, which is not a naturally occurring element. Commonly detectable in shrimp in the Pacific, however, due to nuclear testing from the past. And while the radiation levels were relatively low, it was still higher than expected, so they recalled the shrimp out of an abundance of caution. It is believed that these higher than normal levels were caused at the processing facility by a nearby scrapyard that had been smelting some contaminated metal, and the contamination was probably spread by the wind. And in order to provide some comparison for people, the article that I read from the American Nuclear Society specifically stated that the amount of radioactivity in the shrimp was about the same as that in bananas. So what's with all this talk about bananas? Well, it's a commonly consumed item that is a healthy snack, and in no way someone would normally be concerned about. Instead of talking about radiation exposure using overly scientific terms that not everybody's familiar with, sometimes we try to relate it to something that people can relate to. So, someone created the banana equivalent dose, or BED, as a way to describe radiation exposure in a way that people could understand. Instead of saying that exposure was 0.1 microsieverts and then having to explain to everybody what that means, you could just say it's the equivalent of eating one banana, which is equal to about 1% of the amount of exposure an individual gets on a normal day. I know it's a little bit silly, but it's really not a bad way of helping people to understand small doses of radiation. And this does predate the current meme of using a banana for scale for everything, so this would be the original use of that meme. So look at this side-by-side comparison of a bunch of bananas and a Fiestaware plate. Old Fiestaware was radioactive because of the uranium used in the ceramics glaze. Now this radiation detector is reading out in microrem per hour at the moment, so both of these items are not very radioactive. Background radiation in this area is around 7 microrem per hour. So the bunch of bananas is reading just slightly above background, while the plate is many times that of background. Now, neither of these levels are anything to be concerned about, but I just thought this was an interesting comparison of everyday items that are radioactive. For a more thorough discussion on radioactive Fiestaware, you can check out the video I made about it, linked in the description. When you're discussing radiation exposure, it is important for people to have a relatable experience in order to understand the relative risk. The thought of radiation exposure evokes a real fear response in many people because it brings up the thoughts of real potential dangers of radiation exposure. And we haven't done a really good job of educating people about the relative risks of radiation exposure. And radiation is kind of scary when you think about it. It's this thing that you can't see, you can't hear, you can't smell or taste, and if you're exposed to enough of it, it can harm or even kill you. Of course that can be scary. But in reality, it's really not that much different from other hazards that we don't worry about nearly as much every day. There are plenty of things in the world that we're exposed to on a regular basis that in small amounts they're nothing to be concerned with, but in large amounts are dangerous. So let's talk about radiation exposure and the relative risk. And I'm going to use this chart that the guys at XKCD came up with, because it's a great visual aid to help understand relative risk of radiation exposure. So if you look at this blue section over here on the left, it contains examples of things that a normal person is exposed to just on a regular basis. Right? So you have, living within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, eating a banana, that's what we've been talking about. Living within 50 miles of a coal plant. Interestingly enough, that's actually more than living within 50 miles of a nuclear plant. In fact, a coal plant actually gives off more radiation than a nuclear plant is legally allowed to. And then there's X-rays and airline flight. And like I said, normal everyday exposure, nothing to be concerned about. So then we go over to this green section here, and this is a little different. You know, this is things that aren't necessarily normal, right? So if you look here, this little section right here is if you got all of the things in the blue section that we were just talking about, right? So a very small amount still. You know, this shows you a chest x-ray, which is not a normal occurrence if you happen to be in Tokyo following the Fukushima accident. You'll see here the yearly dose from just potassium in your body, or the normal background radiation here, down here at the bottom. And then if you happen to be a radiation worker, there's this giant green one over here, and that's, the maximum that a radiation worker can be exposed to in the United States. In this entire green section, even though it's significantly more than the blue section we were talking about, there's still relatively low risk for any negative impact from this radiation exposure when compared to the normal risks of life. So now we're going to go down to this red section here. Well, this red section, it's red for a reason, because this is where we're getting into radiation doses that actually could cause medical issues. And you see here, if you got all of the doses from the green chart, it's still not a huge amount compared to things that we know cause health risks. You see here, lowest 1-year dose clearly linked to increased cancer risk, 100 millisieverts, right? So that's double what the annual dose is allowed for a radiation worker. And still, that's more than what the entire green chart is. If you get all of those things in a year, right? You see radiation poisonings, 400 millisieverts in a short time, severe radiation poisoning of 2,000 millisieverts in a very short time. And then here, dose limits for emergency workers for life-saving. And then obviously down here, fatal dose all the time, usually fatal dose. But I really like this chart. I think it just kind of gives you a really nice way to look at radiation dose in general, and as a visual way to understand the scale of specific types of dose. If you do want to explore this chart more, I'll put a link to it in the description. Okay, so back to the banana. The BED isn't a really accurate scientific model. The amount of potassium in your body stays relatively the same. So if you eat more potassium, you're just going to get rid of some potassium too. So overall, you're not going to increase the amount of potassium in your body by a large amount. But the whole point isn't that this is meant to be an exact scientific unit. It's meant to show people something that they can immediately relate to in order to help them understand the risk that they're being exposed to. Because all risk is relative. It's meant to help people understand something that can be scary if you've never been taught the truth about the hazards of radiation. To help people understand that radioactive doesn't immediately mean dangerous. Radiation is just a part of life, and we're exposed to it regularly, yet we don't really learn much about it in general, and there's a lot of misinformation about it. So we develop simple models to help it make sense in an effort to help people understand when they should or shouldn't be concerned about radiation exposure. It's one of the reasons I started this channel and make these videos. I really wanted to help demystify nuclear power and information about radiation in general. I wanted to teach people about it so that it's not so scary, that it's a safe, reliable form of energy production that can be extremely environmentally friendly, because I truly believe that it is our best option for our base load power needs. And those needs are constantly increasing, and that's not going to change.